Coming to you from Kansas City, Missouri, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government. I'm Lauren Palmer, the Director of Local Government Services for the Mid-America Regional Council, and your host for this episode. GovLove is produced by ELGL, the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network. The best way to support ELGL is to become a member. Check out elgl.org for information on member perks and rates for individuals and organizations. And plan to tune in this year on December 30th for the annual Govy Lovies. Your GovLove hosts and production team will recap the best GovLove episodes of the year and spread a little year-end holiday cheer. Today, I'm visiting with John Littlemore, Head of Housing and Regulatory Services for Maidstone Borough Council in the UK, and Helen Sunderland, Partner in Local Public Services at EY. We are talking about a new data-centric approach to help governments move from reacting to homelessness to actively preventing it. Helen and John, welcome to GovLove.
Hello, Lauren.
Hi, Lauren. Great to meet you.
Likewise, it's great to have both of you here. Well, we are going to start our episode with our signature GovLove lightning round to get to know both of you a little bit better. So John, we're going to start with you. If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
I'd have to be the gift of hindsight. So many times I hear leaders and world leaders saying, oh, if only we'd known that in hindsight. Well, if we had that gift, we could stop all the errors occurring in the first place.
That's a really wise, selfless answer. I mean, most of the time people are like, I want to fly, I want to be invisible. But I think that's really thoughtful and public service oriented.
Thank you.
Helen, what about you? What would be your one superpower?
So you've just ruined mine, Lauren, because I was going to say I want to be invisible, largely because I'm a nosy Parker and quite like to go and hear what other people are kind of talking about, thinking. I'll position it as my kind of interest and excitement in people, and kind of really start able to get under the skin of thoughts, feelings, and how to kind of make change happen. But I am also a little bit nosy as well.
That would probably be my answer too if I was answering the question. But I love that you put kind of this positive, thoughtful spin on it of being insightful, trying to understand people. That's great. All right, so Helen, we'll let you start with this next question. If you could meet any famous person, who would it be and why?
So I'm kind of very practical, and actually, if I was to meet somebody famous, I think it would be someone really creative, because that's a kind of a talent I don't have. So somebody like Baz Luhrmann, or kind of somebody who can visualize and create films, and kind of sets and artistry. I just don't possess that. I'm really intrigued to know how somebody's kind of thought process works, who does have that kind of talent.
I love that answer. When I get questions like this, I'm always kind of in my wheelhouse of like thinking about people I admire in local government or public service. So yeah, I'm impressed that you kind of thought about someone who's like a little outside the box. Good. John, what about you? If you could meet any famous person, who would it be and why?
Yeah, probably like you, Lauren, is somebody that demonstrates those qualities that I admire. And I'd love to meet Martin Luther King Jr. And he demonstrates such resilience and compassion. I'd love to know what he would think of the world today, and I think we could all do with his wise words.
Oh, great answer. Totally agree. I'd love to have that conversation too. All right, and our next question, John, we'll start with you again. What is a hidden talent you have that might surprise people?
Well, at my age, probably that I can still run a marathon. But one of my loves in life is like detailing classic cars. So I really enjoy that as a way to relax. Not everyone's cup of tea, I know, but
those are both impressive talents. I think running a marathon at any age is exceptional. Tell me more about the classic cars. Like, what kind of cars?
Oh, I'm a bit of a fanboy of Jaguar, so but I'm part of the club, but also MGs as well. So I keep both of those in stock. But I also like help out people preparing their cars for different events and that we go to.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Helen, what about you? What's a hidden talent you have that might surprise people?
I can still do a cartwheel. I think it probably impresses my 4-year-old daughter more than anybody else. She thinks it's a great talent. So I'm kind of sticking with that.
That's a huge talent. I'm very impressed. In fact, in the not too distant past, my niece and my daughter were trying to get me to do a cartwheel, and I was like too scared to even try it. So the fact that you like can still do it. Like, applause. Well done. All right. Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about you personally so we can get to know you better. But now let's dive into the heart of our interview. John, I want to start with you. If you could just introduce us to Maidstone. You know, with ELGL, we do have an international membership, but most of our listeners are based in the United States and may not be very familiar with your area of the world in the UK. So I'd love for you to just tell us more about the community that you serve.
Yeah, absolutely. So Maidstone is located in the southeast of England, so southeast of London. I think most people would know where London is, in the county of Kent, often called the Garden of England, and it's also the gateway to Europe. We at Maidstone, we're the county town for Kent, so that means we're like the capital city of Kent, and we have the largest population of around 120,000 people. And it's quite a bit of history to Maidstone. Our oldest resident is Iggy the Iguanodon, who is now resides in the British Natural History Museum as a skeleton, obviously. But we're also noted for being one of the areas that started the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, and was also involved in the English Civil War in 1648. And we've been home to the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment, and currently the 36 Engineers and King's Gurkha Brigade. So we've got quite good links with the military history down the years. But I think we're also known at being the capital of Kent for being the centre of administration as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for that introduction. And then tell us a little bit more about you. Tell us about your career path and how you got into your current position.
Yeah, I started at a young age working for London authorities, which is where I was born and raised. So worked in housing there, decided that actually I really enjoyed working in this field. And as you know, looking around me and seeing what's happening and how we could help people, particularly those who are most vulnerable members of our community, I was kind of driven to stay in this area and to create a career out of it, and being motivated to try and make change for the better, to try and help people make the best of themselves. So that's really what's motivated me to stay in local government. And so I've been at Maidstone nearly 20 years now, so quite some time. I wouldn't have stayed here if I hadn't had the opportunity to innovate and bring in new ideas to the fore. And certainly we've been supported by our elected members here to do exactly that. So when we came across an initiative like the one we're going to talk about, it's that sort of creativity that's kept me motivated down the years to do these sorts of initiatives that make a real difference to people's lives.
I love it. That's what GovLove's all about, shining a spotlight on these stories of innovation in local government. So we are eager to hear more, but first let's learn a little bit more about Helen. Helen, tell us about your career path and the work that you do at EY.
Thanks, Lauren. So quite randomly, I'm a kind of chemist by trade. So I trained as a chemist at uni, spent a little bit of time as a medical sales rep up in the north of England. Got a little bit bored of that quite quickly, found it less rewarding than perhaps I had hoped, but also found myself with a lot of spare time on my hands. So decided to use that spare time to do some volunteering with Age Concern, and spent a lot of time with a 96-year-old lady called Harriet, who complained a lot about the state and the quality of her social care, her social services, and the support she was getting from the local authority. And I think that personal story kind of then really drove me on to think about, well, what can I do? How can I, start to influence and support a change and transformation in this area? That quite randomly aligned with a big policy shift in the kind of early 2000s, the government at the time, towards much more personalised care and support, trying to focus on the person at the centre of it rather than kind of large scale contracts, which got me into consulting. And then 20 years later, a bit like John, the ability to use that convening power of the firm that I am kind of privileged to be part of, to bring innovation, to work with organisations like Maidstone, like other kind of city councils and county councils and district councils in the UK, is a real privilege. And that's kind of what gets me out of bed in the morning, being able to bring some of those approaches to really kind of transform how things are working and to just make them a little bit better. Our public servants are amazing people, and actually to be able to give them the best tools possible to do their job even more so. It's really fantastic.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. I can hear both of you, your passion for public service. And I love this question. We love on GovLove to just highlight the different ways that people find their path into local government. And Helen, I think this is the first time I've ever interviewed someone who said they started out with a background in chemistry. So there's all different kinds of ways to find your career path in public service. And we always kind of encourage people to think about how they might get a career in local government. So thanks for that introduction, and we'll shift now and really get into the heart of what we want to talk about today. So John, we're talking about how Maidstone Borough Council shifted its approach from reacting to homelessness and instead placing a strong emphasis on prevention. So just give us the context for why you made that change.
Yes, I think generally there was a move towards prevention, and the UK government had started to introduce legislation to bring that about. But we decided to take the bull by the horns and do our prevention work ahead of the enactment of that legislation. So by the time it came in, we were quite au fait with how that would operate. And we started to challenge ourselves about, well, actually, how could we go further than what we're being asked to do? What's the next step for us? And the UK legislation was about looking at people who are threatened with homelessness within 56 days. But we were saying, well, what if you could do that much further upstream so that you didn't have to wait for somebody to come to you? You could actually reach out, which was when we came across the whole initiative around the usage of data analytics, which was something that I think was quite well known within the private sector, but not used so much in the public sector. So we struck our conversation with colleagues at EY and an organisation called Centura, who were developing a product around that, which would enable you to reach out at sort of that 6 months ahead, look at the characteristics of somebody who might become homeless in 6 months' time and be able to make contact with them and reach out to support them to avoid that happening. So that was the start of the journey for us.
So you started to touch upon it. Just describe that a little bit more. Describe how that service delivery process was before and how you've utilized data to improve your approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the original UK legislation was a bit archaic in that it was all driven around a 28-day period. But often you'd also have people approaching you who were homeless on the day. And it was very much about, well, actually, how can you try and work with people before they get to that moment of crisis where you're too late and to be able to effect an intervention that could actually stop them becoming homeless. And at the time, we were seeing an increase in homeless approaches because of different dimensions going on in the economy that was driving that. So it was very much for us a motivating factor to try and make sure that we did reach out to people as soon as we could. So we were looking at various ways in which you could do that. But it was very much at that time dependent on somebody coming to us. So we would advertise in newspapers, advertise through social media, please come and use our services. But we were still finding that people were approaching us very late in the day. So we were looking for that key element that could enable us to reach out at a much earlier stage and to people who would not necessarily think of coming to us for help.
Okay. So you created this partnership with EY. Helen, I'm going to ask you to share just the mechanics of how this worked. Like, how did you start sharing data across agencies to get to this more preventive approach that John is describing?
Sure. And I think kind of, huge kudos to Centura, the organization that John's just mentioned, as our kind of the data analytics platform provider. So in terms of some of the capability that's put in place, it's their kind of technical platform that underpins a lot of this, just to be clear. I suppose there's a couple of bits to this without getting too technical, which I imagine is not the scope of today. So one is really the governance, and kind of starting out with being really clear, aligned to legislation, aligned to kind of the purpose that you're trying to do this, is the governance arrangements that sit around the partners who are going to be sharing data. So the kind of who, what, why, where, when and how, important questions to answer. And actually upfront, that's quite a significant amount of the work, just ensuring that organizations get really, really comfortable with what do you need, why do you need it, how are you going to treat it, so that there's kind of trust and trust in the way that that's delivered. But that's kind of the first stage of the process. So what we call in the UK DPIAs, but they're essentially data protection sharing agreements that allow and document all of those aspects. I think the second part really is, and what's quite clever about the OneView platform is the way that it creates that into a set of kind of really operationalized technical requirements. So for example, like a lot of people will do a DPIA and that just goes and sits on a shelf or props your door open or something, and it's a paper document. Actually, through the system that's been deployed, there's a capability to actually in real time monitor who's accessing what, why, where, and when, to keep a record and a track of that data is being used in the kind of right way. Another important aspect, I think, is that it's all pseudonymized as well. So just getting into a slightly more technical aspect, once the data sharing agreements are in place with other agencies, there's a variety of different ways they're collected, but generally it's through a kind of secure integrated platform passed from organization to organization, and then it's pseudonymized, because I think a big part of the trust aspect of this is that somebody doesn't think there's a massive data lake somewhere with all of the information about them contained on it just being kind of thrown around all over the place. And actually the pseudonymization, the security that sits around that has been really important. That then only reconnects the name and the remaining data when a certain risk level is met. So yeah, kind of in summary, we have the agreements put in place. The technical architecture is then created that aligns to those agreements. Data is provided from other organizations at relevant frequency. So it's sometimes, if it's financial information, it's a weekly update. For other information, it's slightly slower. And the purpose and that underpins all of that has been really important, and the kind of reason behind why we are using that data. I talked a little bit about it being a risk-based model. So one of the things that John mentioned is actually the purpose of this is to try and get ahead of the game, to try and understand not those who are homeless, but actually, or experiencing homelessness, but actually where the risk is increasing, that they might do circa 8 to 10 weeks in the future, because actually the range of things that you have at your disposal in terms of tools to support people is so much broader if they're not stood on your door with a suitcase. And I think that's a really important aspect of this, to understand, if it is debt that's an issue, if it is kind of chaotic life experiences, that's another really important aspect of that. Caseworkers are then provided with that information once the risk has been identified at a certain level through what's called a case summary. So that sits on top of their existing systems. It's not an extra system that they have to go into, which is really important just in terms of the practicalities of how this works. And they can almost scrape the relevant information needed to then go and support that family or support that individual, not only on the immediate presenting thing, but also have a much richer conversation about other services that they might want to access. For example, services that the county council might provide in the kind of mental health and social care space, or other things that are a bit beyond the reach of the district council's normal interventions, but actually the district council's fantastic network of other providers that can connect them to. And that's where some of the real richness comes from, actually, is that you're not just solving the problem right in front of you, you're actually providing some resilience for that individual and family in terms of connecting them to the broader set of things.
That's great. So you're describing when a certain risk level is met, then that triggers a certain type of response. Can you give us a sense of how you determine which indicators to measure to predict that risk level for homelessness?
So, sort of, and I think it's really important that we haven't put down a set of predetermined characteristics. We don't pigeonhole people. This is not about kind of putting people in boxes and saying this will happen if you tick these three boxes, for example. I just think that's a really important thing to get out up front. The way that it kind of develops is that we took, I think, 2 years plus of Maidstone's data, and actually you run kind of the models and the AI over the data. If we know the outcome was homelessness, or a person became homeless, actually if you look back through, how do you start to spot patterns in what is leading to that outcome? So for example, we do know that as you start to see escalating rental debt, escalating council tax debt, which kind of makes sense, right? That if people's debt is escalating, the likelihood of them being able to continue to pay their rent bills, etc., is getting worse. But that's not to say debt is always a predeterminant of homelessness. It's really important we don't get into that space. But John, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, and I think what was really great about the scheme that we engaged with was nuanced over the first 6-12 months. So as we started to get better experience using the product and looking back at some of the interventions and what was the information was telling us, we were able to, as I say, develop those characteristics to be more effective. And we're still doing that now. So now we can target specific groups, such as people who we might feel be affected by domestic abuse, for example, as a way of, being able to reach out again at an early stage before that escalates.
So, Helen or John, how do caseworkers access the data to initiate contact with at-risk households? I hear you describing this process where the data is all anonymized, but you're looking for indicators to hit a certain risk level. And then once that level is met, kind of walk us through that process of how the data gets to the hands of a caseworker and then what they do with it next.
Sure. Do you want me to start, John, and you can pick up on?
Absolutely.
So Zantura essentially provides kind of 5 to 10 case IDs. So again, no names, where the kind of characteristics have reached a certain level. Then it started a few years ago with one caseworker who used to manage all of those. Now the whole team are actually using the product, which is fantastic. They, as I mentioned, they use their existing system, and that ID, and again, then through all the information governance and roles-based access to the system, allows them to view what is called a case summary. So in their existing system, there's a little button on top of a case ID that says access one view, basically, and that then provides a case summary with things like a chronology of what's happened when, with the relevant information to allow for that worker to then proactively reach out and have a conversation with the individual or family about areas that they might be struggling. I suppose a couple of really important points that I mentioned in that. It's roles based. So for example, a team worker in the benefits team would not have access to lots and lots of social care information about that individual, but they might know that they're in contact with social services so that they've got a broader perspective. I think the information governance on this is really critical, and actually is why it works so well, is that it's not a one size fits all as to who can see what once the information's surfaced. It's very much roles based. And I think that the kind of second aspect really is that it's surfaced in words rather than pie charts and graphs. I know when people think about analytics, they think, oh God, I'm going to have to deal with a graph or a bar chart and try and configure it. We actually use something called natural language generation that takes the data and information and converts it into what you and I would know as case notes, in the same way as if you'd handwritten them yourself, which gives a bit of a richer picture kind of around that to then allow the engagement and the conversation to happen. And I think probably the third thing, I know I said two, but the third thing I'll add, the interventions aren't punitive. And I think that's really important as to why actually this has been quite well accepted and works quite well, is because it's a proactive outreach to offer support rather than I found you've been up to something and I'm, going to fine you or do something else. I mean, not to be glib, but I think that it being not a punitive kind of outcome or outreach is a really important bit as to why people are more receptive to it.
And I think that's why we were very concerned about getting the right person in to do that work, but especially in the setting up the system, setting up this whole scheme. So we managed to employ somebody who was fantastic, whose skill sets just were perfect to this work. So she's able to reach out to people in such a way, and she doesn't give up. She may not get the hit back on the first interaction, but she doesn't pursue people, but she's there to offer that help. And when people are ready to reach out and accept that assistance, then she's fully engaged with them. And it's interesting what you said earlier about, these aren't necessarily the traditional issues that they're dealing with. So there's a great example of one household that we assisted who were owner-occupiers, probably wouldn't have thought of coming to a local authority for help previously, getting into debt. And what was at the bottom of that was a gambling addiction. So not necessarily something that we would deal with. not necessarily something you'd think in the first instance. It enabled our officer, as you say, to make those connections with the voluntary groups that we work with to get assistance to that household around those things. So not only are we assisting those clients in a way that we probably previously wouldn't have, it's also reinvigorated our staff to think differently about their role, gives them much more job satisfaction than just, filling out forms and going through the usual process. So it's been a really good outcome all ways round.
Yeah, you really answered a question I had for you, which is, in my experience, government officials are often perceived as the regulators or the enforcers, and not always perceived as being helpful or proactive. And so I'm really curious how you have ensured that individuals and families that you're connecting with are receptive to this outreach. So it sounds like getting the right staff in the right role is a key part of that. Is there anything else that you would add of how you've helped people be receptive?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a lot. What we did was quite a bit of reflection ourselves on what we were trying to achieve and how was the best way to achieve that. And we were constantly reviewing that, because to begin with, it takes time to build up the confidence of the staff, but also in terms of being able to get assurance that our approach is being effective. So we did look back at different, are we using the right way to reach out to people? Is it better to contact by phone, by email? So we tried a whole range of activities to try and hone down what was the best way to do that. I think working in homelessness, most of the officers that are engaged in that line of work are probably lean towards more the assistance rather than the punitive anyway. But you're quite right, local authorities can be seen in that way. So it was important that, we go in with those sort of softer skill sets and make people feel confident and that they can trust us and reach out to us. And that's proven to be, people are receptive to that. And the figures that we came out with at the end of it demonstrated that completely, that once you get that approach right, people will be grateful. And I think what was interesting as well, talking about data protection, all of those issues, we've never had a client complain about where did you get that information from. The expectation amongst most people is that we do share that information anyway, so they weren't surprised that we had that information. And as I say, people saw it as a benefit, not as an intrusion.
Yeah. Helen, in researching for this episode, I read that this project really embraced human-centered design. So I'd love to hear more about how you integrated the perspectives of recipients of services into this preventative model.
Sure. I think there's a couple of stakeholders actually in the human-centered design aspect, the residents who we're trying to support, but actually, and I sort of alluded to it earlier, some of the staff members who are going to be using the tool as well, because I think that's a big driver into what influences how well that works. So I suppose kind of starting with the residents, there's a couple of ways. One being part of the capability of OneView is that it doesn't just read tick boxes, it actually reads unstructured data as well. So each time somebody has an interaction with the family and writes up their case notes, that becomes part of the information. And as John mentioned, like it's really interesting to see how the prioritization is not the right word, the grading, if you like, of the indicators over time as more nuance and more richness of data comes into the system, you start to really see and unpick what you previously might have just said, oh, it's debt, actually has got a much richer picture of what sits underneath that in terms of root cause as well. So there's an aspect of human-centered design like naturally built into the product itself. I think the other part of this is, and going back to John's point, the engagement and the reception that Anna, who was the original kind of caseworker on this that John's talked about, and then latterly as more people have started to use it, the feedback they're getting in terms of the interventions and support that's available and how that's regularly reviewed and brought into scope to say, should we be looking at a cohort of people differently? Should we have a bit of a differential focus on, for example, individuals experiencing domestic abuse who the cost of living crisis might mean that they literally can't afford to leave the perpetrator? You know, like all of that richness of how do we target, how do we focus, how do we prioritize? And so you've not only got what's brought into the system through notes, but actually the proactive feedback of those individuals doing the outreach work kind of as part of that. I think the second part of human-centered design was really, and I think alluded to it earlier, that pie charts, graphs and lines don't really speak to people, stories speak to people. So working really, really closely with the staff who are going to be using this to ensure that the case notes, what I talked about, the case summaries, the way that this information surfaced was really usable, was really like it helped them do their job rather than hindered them doing their job, and actually then enhanced how they do their jobs, to the point where their jobs are now broader and more exciting and more engaging than perhaps they have been before, because you get this broader kind of reward from actually really making a difference on the ground before something happens. And it's really been interesting, like actually being able to prove the case for prevention, because I think that's something that organizations have really struggled with. We all kind of know it's the right thing to do, but I think it's the first time in a while we've actually kind of proved it. I think the last point, and this is where, again, I think the two things have come together really nicely, is we're not only using data to identify, there's actual action taken as a result of it. So this is operationalized data analytics, and you do not, as much as people tell you, so many of I've got this dashboard and that dashboard, actually really truly operationalizing analytics on the front line to get a better decision, to reduce administration time, and to actually deliver a better outcome as a result. To me, that outcome is truly human-centered.
Yep. So true. John, as we were preparing for this episode, you shared that you and maybe others had early skepticism about whether data could be used to predict and prevent homelessness. So can you share some of the successful outcome that you have reported from this work?
Yeah, I can admit that in front of Helen now. Now that we have shown it work. It has been a really interesting journey. And to begin with, as Helen said, we appointed a lady called Anna, who's been great in the role. And we were minded not to swamp her with cases to try and make this work. So although we were receiving quite a number of alerts, we limited the number that Anna would receive each week. Not by design, more by accident than design. We ended up then at the end of a year with a control group of those that had been helped by Anna and a control group of those who hadn't been assisted by Anna. And we could track the journeys of both of those cohorts to see what the outcomes were. And they were really quite stark, surprised myself, but really reinforced how you could demonstrate that this does have a real impact.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, John, but I just want to make sure I understand. So your control group were people who used your prior process. They were coming to you. They were coming to you and asking for service. And then this group that you said Anna was working with, these are people you were proactively reaching out to based on indicators from the data.
Absolutely. So we could see, absolutely. So let's say, for instance, there were 400 people that we didn't reach out to through this system, and there were 300 people that we did reach out to that Anna assisted. So of the group that Anna worked with, only 2%, less than 2% of those ended up becoming homeless and having to go into temporary accommodation provided for by the local authority. Of the group that weren't assisted, that was nearly 20%. So there was a significant difference in terms of what the impact of this scheme was for those that did receive the help from those that didn't.
Yeah, very incredible numbers. So I want to ask this question of both of you, and Helen, we'll start with you. What advice do you have for communities that are really intrigued by this and looking for effective strategies to address homelessness? Where should they start?
So it's really interesting, actually, because we're really excitedly in conversations with an area in the US at the moment. Because one of the challenges kind of put back to us is, okay, we've done it with UK-based data architecture. Is it portable? So a very kind of real and ready question. And I think for me, a little bit about this is kind of chunking it up into to overcome that skepticism and really understanding what your points and your stories of difference are. So for example, kind of question number one, with the data architecture that you have through various different agencies that interact with people, can you predict homelessness? So we proved quite early on in the UK that you can predict the likelihood of somebody becoming homeless for a range of different factors. And I wouldn't say it's one journey fits all at all, but we know that as risk factors start to emerge, we can identify where there is increased risk. So I think kind of question one is almost tackle that. I think the second bit is your system set up in a way, or can you change it, that you can actually do something to support those individuals? So a really important thing that John mentioned earlier is there was a bit of a change in statutory duty actually that was a motivator, but actually in the UK there is an architecture where, you know, fundamentally, should someone become homeless, the responsibility and the statutory duty to deal with that does sit somewhere. So actually preventing it, there is as well as the broader resident outcomes, there's a genuine financial case for preventing it as well. So to me, kind of question number two is who bears the risk, and actually whose interest is it to really start to drive this? Now that could be an organisation that bears the cost of homelessness. It could be an area that you know, house prices and business rates and various other things are impacted because you have an increase in you know, in kind of street-based homelessness. But actually really important to answer the question, can we do something? And then lastly, it's like who, how, pathways and impact. So to me, they're the kind of three things that organizations or communities who are wanting to kind of approach this is, does the data allow us, and does someone have the power to do it? Can we actually make a difference? Once we've found people, are there interventions available that will make a difference? Because a big part of the Maidstone journey is that we didn't just find them, we did something, and therefore there was an impact. And then actually, can you transform the system to then make those two things done in a sustainable way rather than done as a one-off? So they would be my kind of bits of advice.
Yeah, very good advice. John, what about you? Any advice for our listeners who may be starting this journey?
Yeah. I think sometimes you have to be bold and you have to take those risks. And I'm so pleased that we did in this instance. As Helen points out, the cost to us as a local authority, but the wider societal cost in terms of pound, shilling and pence, that's probably won't work well with American dollars and cents. There's that, which is significant. But there's also, and more importantly for us, I think, is, you know, we avoided the disruption being caused to those families having to go into temporary accommodation, all the trauma that brings with it. That has an impact on people's health and well-being, but also, you know, particularly if children are involved, affects their educational attainment and then their job prospects. So, you know, if you can break into that cycle at some point by doing a project like this, then it's well worth taking that risk. So yeah, I'd encourage all local government people to, you know, be bold about what you want to do if you want to make a difference to people's lives.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you. Is there anything else that either of you would like to share before we wrap up?
No, I'm good.
I think just it's been great. It's been really fantastic working on such an exciting and innovative piece of work. And I think, you know, to my point earlier on why I got into this job, I'm so privileged to be able to have, you know, clients like John and others that are bold, are purpose driven, and actually are kind of prepared to take some of those steps to do something really differently. And just what a pleasure it's been working on this and seeing the real impact, you know, on top of dollars and cents, actually, of people's lives not being as kind of tragically impacted as they can be if things go the wrong way. So it's certainly a start in terms of, I'm not sure we've quite cracked solving homelessness, but definitely we're on the right track, which is an amazing thing to be able to say.
Yeah.
Well, this is really great. I appreciate both of you coming on GovLove to share this story. You know, on GovLove, we've featured quite a few episodes that touch on some aspect of affordable housing or homelessness and trying to highlight different strategies to address the issue. But this, I think, maybe is one of the first times that we've really honed in on this idea of utilizing data, which really appeals to our audience. We've got a lot of data analytics minded people in our local government world who I think will really latch on to this idea of preventing homelessness and not just thinking about strategies to address it. So thank you so much. As we wrap up, we always love to end our episode with one final question. So John, if you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as our exit music for this episode?
It'd have to be Matt Monroe singing Impossible Dream.
Okay, that's great. Let's get that Impossible Dream. Well, that ends our episode for today. Thanks so much to our guests, John Littlemore and Helen Sunderland. Thank you for listening. If you have questions or ideas for future podcast episodes, you can reach us at elgl.org/govlove or on Twitter at GovLovePodcast. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government. To bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, to right the unrightable wrong.